If you've ever been told you don't belong, wait until you see what happens when the truth walks into the room uninvited. The mansion rose like a statement against the Manhattan skyline, 18,000 square feet of glass, marble, and quiet power, every chandelier casting golden light over a room filled with people who measured worth in net value and last names, and at the center of it all stood Logan Pierce, the man who had turned ambition into a billion-dollar empire, his tailored suit flawless, his smile practiced, his voice carrying effortlessly as he entertained investors, politicians, and names that opened doors. Across the country, tonight was his night, his deal, his celebration, and nothing, absolutely nothing, was supposed to disrupt it, until the doors opened without announcement and she walked in, not loud, not dramatic, just present, Avery Cole, in a black dress so simple it refused to compete with the room yet somehow commanded it, her steps measured, her gaze steady, like someone who had already seen the end of the story. A few heads turned, then more, whispers forming like ripples across still water, because there was something about her that didn't match the invitation list, something that didn't fit the narrative Logan had built so carefully, and then he saw her, really saw her, and for half a second the world around him flickered, but just as quickly it hardened again into that familiar cold control, the kind that had once built his success and quietly destroyed everything else. His lips curved, not in surprise, but in something sharper, something designed to cut. Some people don't belong in rooms like this, he said casually, as if commenting on the weather, but the silence that followed made it clear exactly who he meant. The air shifted, conversations paused, and Avery didn't flinch, not even when security began moving toward her with polite, rehearsed authority, because 5 years ago, she would have lowered her eyes. 5 years ago, she would have explained, apologized, tried to make herself smaller in a world that never intended to make space for her, but that woman no longer existed, and Logan didn't notice the difference, not yet. To him she was still the past he had erased, the mistake he had corrected, the name he no longer spoke. I think you should leave before you embarrass yourself, he added, louder this time, inviting the room to agree, and some did, with quiet smiles and knowing glances, because in this world, perception was currency, and Avery looked like someone who had none. But what no one saw, what no one could see, was the story written beneath the surface, the signatures no one questioned, the ownership hidden behind layers of silence, the truth waiting patiently for its moment. And as the music softened and the tension sharpened, Avery finally moved, not backward, not toward the exit, but forward, one step into the light, and for the first time that night, something in Logan's expression hesitated, just for a breath, because deep down, in a place he refused to acknowledge, something felt off, like a game he thought he was controlling had already been decided, and the only thing left was the reveal. The room did not breathe, it watched, because something invisible had just shifted, the kind of shift that does not announce itself but changes everything, and Logan felt it before he understood it, a subtle fracture in the certainty he wore like armor, his fingers tightening slightly around the glass in his hand as Avery stepped further into the light, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving with a calm that did not ask for permission, and that alone unsettled him more than any confrontation ever could, because he remembered a different version of her, one who used to wait for his approval, one who measured her words carefully, one who believed in the future he promised. But this woman did not look like she was waiting for anything, and the difference pressed against his chest in a way he refused to acknowledge. You really should not be here, he said again, softer now but sharper, like he needed the words to land, to restore order, to remind the room and himself who controlled the narrative. But Avery only glanced at him briefly, her expression unreadable, not angry, not hurt, just composed, and somehow that absence of reaction made the whispers grow louder, because people in that room understood power, and they recognized when someone did not need to defend themselves. Security paused halfway to her, uncertain now, their training telling them to proceed, their instincts telling them to wait, and across the room, a few executives exchanged quiet looks, because there was something familiar about her presence, something they could not quite place but could not ignore either. Logan noticed it too, the way attention shifted, the way the energy of the room no longer centered entirely around him, and it irritated him in a way that felt dangerously close to loss of control. So he stepped forward, closing the distance between them with practiced confidence, lowering his voice just enough to make it personal. Whatever you think you are doing, this is not your place anymore. The words were meant to dismiss, to reduce, to remind her of the past he had rewritten, but instead they seemed to hang in the air, unanswered, because Avery did not argue, she did not defend, she simply looked at him, and in that quiet, there was a history he could not erase, a memory of contracts signed at a small kitchen table, of late nights when the future had been nothing but an idea they built together, of a voice that once believed in him before anyone else did, and for a brief second, something flickered in his eyes, not regret, not yet, but recognition, quickly buried beneath pride. 5 years, he added, almost as if to justify himself, and you still do not understand how this world works. But the moment he said it, the words felt weaker than they should have, because Avery's gaze did not break, and somewhere in the distance, the music softened further, the host shifting nervously near the stage, waiting for a signal that had not yet come, until finally, a voice cut cleanly through the tension, precise, controlled, impossible to ignore. Before we proceed with the evening, there is a matter that requires clarification regarding the ownership of this estate. And just like that, every conversation stopped, every head turned, and for the first time that night, Logan's confidence did not return immediately, because something in the tone of that announcement did not sound like a formality, it sounded like a reveal, and without realizing it, his grip tightened again as the ground beneath everything he believed he owned began, quietly, to shift. The word ownership did not land like a detail, it landed like a crack through glass, subtle at first but impossible to ignore, and the moment it echoed across the ballroom, something inside Logan stilled, not fear, not yet, but awareness, the kind that arrives just before everything changes, the kind that whispers that the rules you thought you controlled may no longer belong to you. The host shifted on stage, clearing his throat with a smile that no longer felt rehearsed but cautious. We have recently completed a transfer of title regarding this property, he said, his voice measured, professional, but carrying an edge of gravity that pulled every eye forward. The chandeliers above seemed brighter now, harsher somehow, illuminating expressions that had turned from amusement to curiosity, and Logan felt it, the attention moving, not away from him entirely, but no longer anchored to him alone. And that had never happened before, not in a room like this, not on a night like this. He glanced briefly toward his legal advisor across the room, expecting a nod, a reassurance, something to confirm that this was routine, expected, irrelevant, but the man did not nod. He did not even meet Logan's eyes. Instead he was looking at the stage with the same stillness as everyone else, and for the first time that evening, Logan's certainty did not return on command. As of this evening, the host continued, each word precise, deliberate, the estate you are all standing in is under new ownership. A pause followed, not dramatic, just long enough for the weight of the sentence to settle, and in that pause, Logan's mind moved quickly, calculating, reviewing, rejecting possibilities, because he knew this property, he knew the deal. He had personally approved the lease, verified the ownership, ensured that tonight reflected his level, his status, his control. There was no variable he had not considered, no detail he had overlooked, and yet something in the tone of that announcement suggested otherwise. Something that did not fit into any version of the outcome he had planned, and slowly, almost against his own instinct, his gaze shifted back to Avery, and this time, he did not see an interruption. He saw a question. One he had not asked, one he had not wanted to ask, because the answer might undo everything he believed about this moment, about her, about himself. Avery stood exactly where she had been, but the room around her had changed. The whispers no longer circled her, they paused, waiting, as if she were not outside the story but at the center of it, and that realization pressed against Logan's chest with quiet force. 5 years ago, he had defined the ending, he had decided what she was worth, where she belonged, what future she could have without him. And he had never looked back, because in his world, endings were final, and people like Avery did not return, not like this, not into rooms like this, not with this kind of presence. But now, standing under the same lights he once believed he owned, she did not look like someone who had come back to ask for anything. She looked like someone who had come back to reveal something, and before Logan could form the thought fully, before he could step forward or speak or reclaim the space that felt like it was slipping through his fingers, the host turned slightly, extending a hand toward the edge of the stage, his voice shifting just enough to signal that the next moment would not be a continuation, but a turning point. At this time, the new owner has requested to address the guests personally, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain, it was expectant, and without hesitation, without announcement, Avery took a step forward into the light, and everything Logan thought he understood about power began to unravel in real time. Avery did not rush, and that was the first thing that unsettled everyone watching, because in rooms like this, people who did not belong either hesitated or hurried, but she did neither. She simply walked, each step measured across polished marble that reflected the chandeliers above, the soft echo of her heels carrying farther than any raised voice could, and as she moved closer to the stage, the distance between perception and reality began to collapse in a way no one could stop. Logan remained still, but not by choice. Something held him there, something invisible yet undeniable, like the moment just before a storm breaks when the air becomes too heavy to ignore. His mind searched for logic, for explanation, for a version of events that restored control, but none came, because every instinct that had guided him to success was now telling him something was wrong, deeply wrong, and the more he watched her, the clearer that feeling became. Avery stepped onto the stage without waiting for invitation, without looking back, and the host, who moments ago had owned the room, stepped aside without question, yielding space not out of courtesy but recognition, the kind that does not need to be spoken. And when she turned to face the crowd, the silence shifted again. It was no longer curiosity. It was attention, focused and unbroken, because whatever was about to happen had already moved beyond expectation. Avery did not smile. She did not perform. She simply stood there, her presence filling the space in a way that could not be explained by appearance or history, only by certainty, the kind built over time, in silence, in decisions no one else witnessed. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, steady, carrying without effort. 5 years ago, I was told I did not belong. The words were simple, but they landed with weight, because they did not ask for sympathy, they did not seek validation, they stated a fact, and in that fact lived a story no one in that room fully understood. Logan felt it like a mirror turning toward him, not accusing, not emotional, just precise, and that precision cut deeper than any confrontation could have, because it left no room for denial. I was told I did not understand this world, Avery continued, her gaze moving briefly across the room before settling nowhere in particular, as if the truth did not require a target, that I did not have what it takes to stay in it. A pause followed, not for effect, but because the next words did not need to be rushed, and in that pause, something in Logan's chest tightened, not enough to break, but enough to shift, to remind him of a version of the past he had chosen to forget, a version where success had not been guaranteed, where belief had come from someone else first, someone standing in front of him now, unchanged in ways he could no longer define. So I left, she said quietly, and the simplicity of that sentence carried more power than any dramatic retelling could have, because leaving had not been an ending, it had been a beginning no one had seen, no one had questioned, no one had prepared for. And as she stood there now, under the same lights that once belonged to his world, Logan realized something he had never considered before, the possibility that what he had dismissed as absence had actually been transformation, and that the story he thought he had finished had continued without him, growing, evolving, until it no longer needed his version of events to exist. Avery's eyes did not find his, but he felt the distance between them close in a way that had nothing to do with space, because for the first time that night, the power he had relied on did not respond. It did not rise to meet the moment, it hesitated, and in that hesitation, the truth began to take shape, not loudly, not dramatically, but with quiet certainty, the kind that changes everything without asking permission. The silence did not break when Avery finished speaking, it deepened, because what she had said was not a performance, it was a truth that did not need applause, and in that stillness, every person in the room began to realize they were no longer watching a disruption, they were witnessing a shift, something irreversible, something that had already taken place long before this night. Avery let the moment breathe, not out of hesitation but control, because she understood something Logan had not yet accepted, that power did not need to prove itself when it was real, it only needed to reveal itself, and slowly, she turned slightly toward the host, offering a small nod, a signal, and that was all it took, because within seconds, a man stepped forward from the side of the stage, dressed not for attention but authority, a legal advisor whose presence carried weight without introduction. He held a slim portfolio, nothing dramatic, nothing exaggerated, just paper, just ink, just the kind of evidence that rewrites reality without raising its voice. For clarity, the man began, his tone even, professional. The transfer of ownership for this estate was completed 30 days ago under a private acquisition agreement. The words were simple, but they landed like structure beneath everything, solid, undeniable. Logan's breath slowed, not by choice but by instinct, because something inside him was beginning to connect, pieces he had never considered aligning into a possibility he did not want to see. The advisor continued, the purchasing entity was a holding company operating under the name Cole Ventures, and just like that, the room shifted again, not loudly, not chaotically, but with the quiet recognition that comes when a name suddenly means something different, when it stops being invisible and becomes central. Logan felt it in the way people glanced at Avery now, not as an outsider, but as someone they should have recognized sooner, someone they had underestimated without realizing it, and for the first time that night, the confidence he had relied on did not return, because there was no version of this outcome that fit into the story he had written, no explanation that allowed him to remain untouched by what was unfolding. His mind moved quickly, searching for error, for misinterpretation, for any detail that could restore the balance he had always controlled, but every instinct he trusted told him the same thing: this was real, and it had been real long before he stepped into this room. Avery did not look at him as the realization began to settle. She did not need to, because this was not about confrontation, it was about clarity, and clarity does not argue, it reveals. She stepped closer to the edge of the stage, her presence steady, unshaken, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the same calm certainty. Ownership is not always loud, she said, and the words seemed to echo beyond the room itself. Sometimes it is built quietly, decision by decision, long before anyone notices, and in that moment, Logan understood something he had never considered, that while he had been measuring success in visibility, in recognition, in control, Avery had been building something else entirely, something that did not require his approval, something that did not depend on his world to exist, and as the truth settled fully into place, heavier than any accusation could have been, he realized the one thing he had never questioned: the assumption that he had always been ahead, had been wrong. And the cost of that mistake was now standing in front of him, undeniable, unshaken, and completely out of his reach. The air did not return to normal after the revelation, it shifted into something sharper, something more precise, because now every glance carried calculation, every whisper carried reconsideration, and Logan felt it all at once, not as noise, but as absence, the absence of control he had always commanded without question, the absence of certainty that had once defined every room he entered. And for a man who had built his life on anticipation and strategy, that absence was louder than anything. Avery had said. He stepped forward, not aggressively, not dramatically, but with intention, as if movement alone could restore balance, could pull the narrative back into his hands. But even as he moved, something inside him hesitated, because the version of Avery he had known would have reacted, would have responded, would have met him halfway, and this woman did not. She remained exactly where she was, grounded, unshaken, as if the space itself adjusted around her instead of the other way around. "You expect me to believe this?" he asked finally, his voice controlled, but no longer effortless, because beneath the surface, something had already begun to fracture, not his authority in the room, but his understanding of it. Avery turned her gaze toward him then, not sharply, not emotionally, just directly, and in that moment, the distance between them felt clearer than ever, not measured in steps, but in time, in choices, in everything that had happened after he stopped paying attention. "It is not about belief," she replied, her tone even, steady, "it is about fact." And the simplicity of that answer removed every path he could have taken to challenge it, because facts do not argue, they stand, and as they stood there facing each other, the room around them seemed to recede, conversations held in suspension, attention locked, because this was no longer just about ownership, it was about something deeper, something unspoken, the kind of moment where power reveals not only who holds it, but who understands it. Logan exhaled slowly, his mind working through the implications with the precision that had built his empire. Cole Ventures, the acquisition, the timing, the silence, every detail forming a pattern he had not seen until now, and the realization did not come as shock, it came as clarity, sharp and undeniable, because the truth had been there all along, just outside his focus. "You planned this," he said, not accusing, but acknowledging, because anything less would have sounded weak in a room that no longer responded to his assumptions. Avery did not deny it, she did not confirm it with pride. She simply held his gaze for a moment before answering. "I prepared," and that single word carried more weight than any explanation could have, because preparation implied time, intention, patience, everything he had dismissed as irrelevant when he chose to leave her behind, and for the first time, Logan understood the scale of what he had overlooked, not just her growth, but her direction, her discipline, her refusal to be defined by the version of her he had decided was final. The room remained silent, but the silence had changed. It was no longer passive, it was aware, watching a recalibration take place in real time, and as Logan stood there, surrounded by the very symbols of success he had once controlled without question, he realized something that no deal, no contract, no position had ever forced him to confront, that power is not lost in a moment. It is transferred long before anyone notices, and by the time it becomes visible, it is already out of reach, and in that realization, something inside him shifted, not completely, not yet, but enough to understand that this night was no longer his, and had not been for longer than he was willing to admit. The word prepared did not fade, it lingered, settling into the room like something permanent, something that could not be undone or reinterpreted, and Logan felt the weight of it more than anything else she had said, because preparation meant intention. It meant that every step he had taken forward without looking back had been mirrored by steps she had taken in silence, building something he had never thought to question. And now that silence stood in front of him, undeniable, composed, complete. The guests began to shift subtly, not away from Logan, but toward Avery, not physically, but in attention, in perception, the kind that determines who matters in a room long before anyone speaks it out loud. And Logan noticed, of course he noticed, because he had spent years mastering that exact dynamic, reading it, controlling it, shaping it, but tonight it was moving without him, beyond him, and that realization did not come with noise, it came with absence, the absence of influence he had always assumed was his by default. He glanced around briefly, expecting to find an anchor, someone to reaffirm his position, a partner, an ally, a signal that this moment was temporary. But what he saw instead was something unfamiliar, respect, not directed at him, but at her, quiet, measured, unmistakable, and it changed everything. You built this without ever saying a word, he said, not as a challenge, but as an observation that surprised even him, because the scale of it was only now becoming clear. Avery did not react immediately, she let the statement exist, let it settle into the space between them, because she understood something he was only beginning to see, that recognition, when it finally arrives, does not need to be rushed, it needs to be felt, not everything needs to be announced, she answered after a moment, her voice carrying the same calm certainty that had defined every word she spoke that night. Some things are stronger when they are built without noise, and the truth of that statement moved through the room with quiet force, because everyone there understood the language of visibility, the need to be seen, to be known, to be acknowledged, and what Avery described stood in contrast to all of it. Something deeper, something more controlled. Logan nodded slightly, almost without realizing it, because there was no argument left in him that could dismantle what stood in front of him, only the gradual understanding that the narrative he had relied on, the one where he defined success, had been incomplete, and that incompleteness was now visible to everyone. He took a slow breath, steadying himself, recalibrating not as a man losing ground, but as someone forced to reassess it entirely. Why now? He asked. And the question was not defensive, it was genuine, because timing mattered, timing had always mattered, and if she had built all of this over years, then tonight was not coincidence, it was choice. Avery's gaze met his fully for the first time, not confrontational, not emotional, just clear, and in that clarity, the answer carried more than words alone, because now you can see it, she said, and the simplicity of that response held a precision that left no room for misunderstanding. Because what she had built had not changed tonight, only his awareness of it had, and that distinction was everything. The room remained silent, but it was no longer waiting, it was absorbing, processing the shift that had already taken place, and as Logan stood there, surrounded by the very symbols of power he had once believed defined him, he realized that power had never been about possession alone, it had been about perception, about understanding what was real long before it was revealed, and tonight, for the first time in a very long time, he had not seen it coming. The answer did not echo, it settled, quiet and complete, because it did not need to convince anyone, it simply existed, and Logan felt that more than anything else, the finality of it, the realization that nothing in this moment was accidental, nothing was reaction, everything had been decided long before he stepped into this room believing it belonged to him, and for the first time in years, he did not have a response ready, not because he lacked intelligence or experience, but because this was not a negotiation, it was not a deal to be restructured or an outcome to be redirected, it was truth, already established, already visible, already accepted by the very room that had once reflected his authority without question. He glanced around again, slower this time, not searching for support, but acknowledging what had changed. The investors who once leaned toward him now stood in still observation. The partners who once mirrored his confidence now measured their reactions carefully. And at the center of it all, Avery remained. Exactly as she had been, not elevated by the moment, not transformed by attention, just revealed, and that distinction pressed against Logan's understanding of everything he thought defined power, because she had not taken anything from him tonight, she had not challenged him, she had not even corrected him, she had simply shown what already was, and in doing so, she had shifted the entire foundation of the room without raising her voice. "You could have told me," Logan said after a long pause. The words leaving him before he fully examined them, not as accusation, but as something closer to reflection, because somewhere beneath the surface, beneath the layers of pride and distance and time, there was a recognition he could no longer avoid, that there had been a moment, years ago, when he might have understood this version of her, when he might have seen what she was capable of becoming, but that moment had passed the day he decided to define her limits instead of recognizing her potential. Avery's expression did not change, but something in her eyes softened, not with emotion, but with clarity, the kind that comes from having already processed what others are only beginning to face. "You would not have listened," she replied simply, and there was no bitterness in it, no regret, just truth, because listening requires openness, and at that time, he had not been open, he had been certain, and certainty, when misplaced, has a way of closing doors before they are even seen. Logan nodded slightly, the movement small, almost imperceptible, but real, because he understood what she meant, not as a defense, but as a fact he could not rewrite, and in that moment, something shifted. Again, not in the room, not in the perception around them, but within him, a recalibration that did not restore control, but replaced it with something else, awareness, the kind that arrives too late to change the past but just in time to understand it. The music began to return quietly in the background, soft and distant, as if the evening itself was attempting to resume its original rhythm, but nothing felt the same, because once a truth like this is revealed, it does not fade back into the shadows, it remains, shaping everything that follows. Avery stepped back slightly from the edge of the stage, not retreating, not withdrawing, just completing what she had come to do, and in that simple movement, the message became clear. She had not returned for confrontation, she had not returned for validation, she had returned for closure, not the kind that ends a story, but the kind that defines it. And as Logan stood there, watching her without interruption, without defense, he realized something that no success, no title, no achievement had ever required him to understand before, that losing control is not the same as losing everything, but failing to recognize what matters before it is gone, that is the loss that cannot be undone. And for the first time that night, he did not try to take the moment back, because he finally understood that it had never been his to control. The music resumed, but it no longer carried the same meaning. It became background, distant, almost irrelevant compared to the silence that still lingered beneath it, the kind of silence that follows a truth too clear to ignore. Avery stepped down from the stage with the same calm precision she had shown all night, not hurried, not delayed, just complete, and as her heels touched the marble again, the room instinctively made space, not out of obligation, but recognition, because something had changed in a way that could not be undone. Logan remained where he was, watching her, not with the certainty he once carried, but with a clarity that felt unfamiliar, almost heavy, because for the first time, he was not observing someone beneath him, he was witnessing someone beyond his reach, and that distinction settled into him with quiet permanence. People began to move again, conversations returning in careful tones, but the energy had shifted. It no longer revolved around him, it adjusted around her absence even as she was still present, and that absence of control, that subtle repositioning of attention, spoke louder than any applause ever could. Avery did not look back immediately. She moved toward the exit as if the evening had already concluded for her, as if everything that needed to be said had already been delivered with precision, and perhaps it had, because she had not come to stay, she had come to reveal, and now that the truth existed in full view, there was nothing left for her to prove. Logan took a step forward, almost instinctively, as if to call her back, to reclaim something, to say something that might shift the outcome, but the words did not come, because what could be said in a moment like this that would not sound smaller than the silence she left behind? And for a man who had built his life on knowing exactly what to say, that realization carried its own weight. He stopped, not out of hesitation, but understanding, because some moments are not meant to be reversed, they are meant to be accepted. And as Avery reached the grand doors, the same doors she had entered without announcement, she paused briefly, not turning fully, not returning, just enough to acknowledge the space behind her, the room, the past, the version of herself that had once stood there waiting to be recognized. And then she continued forward, leaving it all behind without a single glance. And that was the final shift, not dramatic, not loud, but absolute. Logan exhaled slowly, his gaze following the space where she had been, not searching for her, but absorbing what remained, because in that space lived a lesson he had never needed to learn before, that success measured only by control is incomplete, that power without awareness is fragile, and that the people we dismiss often become the ones who redefine the very ground we stand on. The chandeliers still glowed, the room still held its elegance, the night still moved forward, but for Logan, something fundamental had changed, not his position, not his wealth, but his understanding. And as he stood there, no longer at the center, no longer defining the narrative, he realized that the most powerful moment of the night had not been when Avery spoke, it had been when she chose to walk away, because in that choice, she did not just reclaim her place, she redefined it entirely, and in doing so, she left behind a truth that would not fade with the music, a truth that would remain long after the lights dimmed. Reminding him that the greatest mistake he had ever made was not losing her, it was believing she needed him to become who she was always meant to be.